Okay, let's open with a word of prayer today. Father, thanks so much for a beautiful day. We pray that you will bless all of our friends and family and loved ones, brothers and sisters in the Lord that are in difficult circumstances or soon to be difficult circumstances. We just pray that you would put your hand of protection over them and watch over them. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, today we're going to talk about it is a big deal. So I'm going to make some opening remarks. I have a couple comments I want to make about Bible prophecy and sort of the situation that we find ourselves in. Again, we talk each week about the convergence of events and the things that are happening and coming on the world. Now, I want to make a couple comments why it's a big deal. In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus tells us about some of the things that are going to happen. And in verse 15, he says, "When you therefore see the abomination spoken of by Daniel the prophet." So we know that, first of all, one of the things we can pick up from this statement of Jesus is, we know who wrote the book of Daniel. It was Daniel the prophet. It wasn't somebody else that came along a few centuries after Daniel. It was actually Daniel that wrote it. Jesus identifies Daniel as the author, so we can trust Jesus. We also know that Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, I think Pastor Steve talked about this first hour, he talks about this event in that particular passage. So Daniel talks about it, Jesus talks about it, Paul talks about it, and we know that this happens at this point, and I was reading some things. There are some people who believe the 70th week of Daniel has already been fulfilled. I don't subscribe to that view for a number of reasons. But essentially, this abomination of desolation event occurs in the middle of the week. So Jesus says, "When you therefore see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand." So there's another clue there. You're supposed to read Daniel and understand what Daniel has to say. And listen, this is a reference to Daniel chapter 11. And Daniel chapter 11 is a pretty difficult passage to deal with, because some of it deals with things that have been fulfilled historically, but a lot of it is yet future. So it's determining where that dividing line is. There's a lot of argument among Bible prophecy scholars over that. But then he says this, "When you see this, then let him which be in Judea flee into the mountains." So the command is to flee. And we know that historically, the early church, when the armies of Rome surrounded Jerusalem between 68 and 70 AD and laid siege to Jerusalem, to the point where most estimates I've seen 500,000 to 1 million Jews died during that siege. It was a horrific thing. Some of the things that people had to do to stay alive were things that you don't even really want to talk about. But the interesting thing is that when that happened, the Christians in the area fled. And there's pretty good historical evidence that no Christians died when they saw these events taking place. Now, I don't think that what Jesus was talking about was fulfilled in 70 AD. Some of the things that Jesus talked about in his Olivet Discourse or discourses were fulfilled in 70 AD. There's no doubt about that. But there was also a lot of future events that Jesus was talking about. So he told them, when you see this happen, flee into the mountains. And then a few verses later, it says, after you see this abomination of desolation, it says, "For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor shall ever be." Now, there's some controversy, I think, in the Bible prophecy community, and I'm going to give you my view. Well, I'm going to give you the correct view, of course, but happens to be my view, and the correct view happen to line up quite well here. Now, so I'm going to give you views that I don't necessarily agree with. And these are put out by good people. They're my brothers and sisters in the Lord, and we disagree on this. There is some teaching out there that the Great Tribulation is this entire period of 7 years. But we know that Jesus says, "When you see the abomination, ... for then shall be." So the abomination of desolation, I think almost everybody agrees, occurs in the middle of the 70th week. So the Great Tribulation can't be in the first half of the 70th week, just by definition. And also my view is that the time of Jacob's trouble that's talked about in Jeremiah chapter 30, around verse 6, 7, 8, also describes a period of time, the time of Jacob's trouble, which will be a period of time like no other. It's virtually the same language that Jesus uses when he says, it will be a period of great tribulation such as never was nor ever shall be. Now, another view is, depending, when do the seals open? When do the trumpets sound? When do the bowls of wrath? And there's a lot of controversy about this. Some think they're sequential, some think they're overlapping. I'm not going to get into this, but I've seen a lot of charts that look a little bit like this. The seals and trumpets are in the first half of the 70th week. And they say, now I disagree with this. Okay, I believe the seals are spread out over a longer period of time, and they have a cumulative effect. They're sort of ramping up to a place where they really reach their peak. But so in good people, I mean, I know these people. They say, well, the trumpets, the seals, one of the seals, 1/4 of the world dies, referencing Revelation chapter 6. Now, I don't agree that 1/4 of the world dies in that seal. That's just my view, because I think it's more of a scope of the authority of what's going over. Someone is given power over 1/4 of the earth, such absolute power that they can put a person to death. But I don't think it says he puts 1/4 of the world to death. I just don't think that that's a proper interpretation. But if we assume that they're true, that this is correct, that 1/4 of the world dies when that seal opens, you also know that one of the trumpets, 1/3 of the world dies. And if you do the math on that, what happens is between that seal and that trumpet, if this interpretation is correct, 1/2 of the world's population dies. Right? But we know that after the middle of the 70th week, it is a period of time unlike any other. And one of the ways you judge that is by how many people are dying in these judgments that are poured out. But if half the world dies in the first half of the week, is it possible for more people to die in the second half of the week than died in the first half of the week, knowing that there are survivors at the end? It's a math problem, right? So if half are dead before the middle, and we know there are survivors at the end, then there's less people die in the second half than die in the first half. Do you follow me? And so it's a math problem when you shove all of these judgments into the first half of the 70th week. That's my view. I really, I take Jesus at his word that the second half, after this abomination of desolation, is that period of time will be unlike any time in human history. It will be unmatched, and there will be nothing ever to equal it. So that's why I think we need to be careful. But my point is that when you see these things happen, for example, the abomination of desolation, there are things that have to take place. There's a logistics issue to a lot of Bible prophecy. I've talked about this in reference to Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39, that it says there, it's very clearly that this alliance of nations that come against Israel from the north, mainly, in the latter days, are a great company and a mighty army. Now, I don't think little Hezbollah bands, as significant as they are a great company and a mighty army. And then I also have friends who say, well, in that Ezekiel 38 and 39 war, Islam will be destroyed. Now, I respectfully disagree with this. I think Islam is around until Jesus returns and takes care of it. But they think, well, but how many of let's say there are 150 million radicalized Muslims in the world today. I think that number is probably a low estimate. How big does the army have to be that you have to destroy completely to completely destroy radical Islam. It has to be pretty big. Okay, so when I see, so while I look at Ezekiel 38 and 39, and I watch what's going on in 11, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit today, I don't necessarily subscribe to the fact that we're there yet, because there's a logistic issue. Now people write to me and they say, what? You know, that we have airplanes and armies can get places really quickly today. And my response is the greatest army on planet Earth in 1991, the United States Army, one of the greatest, mightiest, most powerful armies to ever exist, when they were going to go into Kuwait, which is a pretty easy military theater to operate in, aside from the fact that it's a desert. It's relatively flat. It's pretty wide open. It took our people, we're the most logistically equipped and adept army in the world. It took us 6 months to build up our armies. So that's my point, is that I agree there will be a great company and a mighty army, but I don't see 150,000 Hezbollah fighters with Iranian commanders and what's going on in Syria to be what I would consider to be a great company and a mighty army. So we have to be careful that our math works out correctly, and that our logistics are also in place when these things happen. And that brings us to the abomination of desolation, because when we see this abomination of desolation take place, there have to be some things in place. Paul tells us that this event happens when this future leader, we sort of shorthandedly refer to as the Antichrist, the son of perdition, goes into the temple. Okay, now what does that require? Well, it requires a temple. Now we have a temple mount that's under the control of the Muslims. And by the way, people say, well, that temple mount's not where the temple ever was. It was in the city of David. Okay, you still have the same logistical problem, my friends, because the city of Silwan and the city of David is essentially a Muslim area. And if you think World War III will break out by building a temple on the Temple Mount, trust me, building a temple in the city of Silwan, in the village of Silwan, in the city of David area, will cause a world war to break out. It's not going to be any easier logistically. It'll happen when it's time for it to happen. But there has to be some things that happen in between. There has to be an environment in which the temple can be built. And the temple has to be in existence and sacrifices restarted before that abomination of desolation takes place. So that's why when I look at the building of the temple and the discussion about it, the videos, the plans, the Temple Institute, the red heifer, the priest practicing sacrificing the ashes of the red heifer. Why? Because they have a logistics issue. They need to have a certain amount of ashes. So they actually sacrificed the red heifer recently to figure out, not necessarily that the red heifer qualified to be the red heifer, because it can't have any more than a certain number of white hairs on it. I think it's 2. And they have some candidates that they're watching that have been they're being raised in Israel right now. And they say these, so far, they qualify, but they're practicing. And they want to make sure when they sacrifice the red heifer that they have enough ashes to do the purification rituals that they have to do, that's talked about in the book of Numbers. So they're recognizing that they have what? They have a logistics issue, something that has to be done. But the fact that all of this is going on right now, when alliances are forming and people are coming against the nation, the state of Israel, as I think is prophesied to happen, all these things are lining up at all the same time. I think it's a big deal. For example, 100 years ago, there was no state of Israel. A little over 70 years ago, there was no state of Israel. And then the state of Israel came into being. And it was, in my view, that was a big deal. In 1967, in the Six-Day War, they took back the city of Jerusalem for the first time in almost 2,000 years. I think that was a big deal. I think when you see a lot of Arab nations that have had strong historical animosity towards the state of Israel, talking about, we could make peace, we could have a peace deal here. I think all of that is a big deal. And then the question I have is, how many big deals does it take for you to wake up and say that this is a pretty significant time as to the things that we see going on? It is a big deal. Now, I want to make one other comment, because I've been thinking a lot about this and reading and studying a lot. While I believe that the 1948 rebirth of the nation of Israel was significant, and I think sovereignly directed by God to happen, and I celebrate it, I am also concerned that sometimes in Bible prophecy that there's a tendency to say, okay, that one's fulfilled, we don't have to worry about that anymore. Now listen, for a lot of these things to happen, I believe there has to be a state of Israel in existence. It makes sense, because some of the prophecies don't make sense if they don't. But the existence of the state of Israel as it is currently constituted is not the final fulfillment of Bible prophecy. If you look at passages like one of my favorites in Ezekiel 36, it says that I'm going to bring you back into the land, and I'm not doing it because you deserve it. Believe me, you don't deserve it. Go read the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy and see all the prophecies that he gave if you don't do what you're supposed to do. But God says, my name is at stake. My name is at stake because I made these promises and they're going to be fulfilled. But I'm going to bring you back, at least the way I read this, when you don't deserve it. Just like to people who get saved today. You're going to get saved, not because you deserve it, but because of my grace and mercy, because my name is at stake. And he says, when I bring you back into the land, then I will give you a new heart, and you'll believe. So the question I ask is, don't be so quick to say, Ezekiel 36, Ezekiel 37, and those passages are completely, entirely fulfilled, because they're not the full end of it. There's still a lot to happen. There's still unfortunately, a lot of trouble to happen. I recently heard someone comment, and I think it was fairly profound. We have to be careful in Bible prophecy as we watch these things unfold to be fulfilled, that we don't turn what's to be a long, difficult birth process into a C-section. And I thought that was fairly profound. And it made me, I heard it and it made me think. So I know we all want to say, oh, this is done, this is done, this is done, this is done. And I don't think we're all the way there yet. For example, in Isaiah chapter 66, it says, shall a nation be born in a day? And it's common to hear teachings that 1948, nation born in a day, boom, that prophecy's been fulfilled. I think it prefigures what's going to happen, but what's going to happen in the day when they look on me whom they have pierced, is going to be far more glorious in God's plan than the rebirth of the state of Israel in 1948. So let's not truncate the prophecies of God, but what we see going on is a big deal, and there's a lot of things that we see happening in the world. So we're going to talk about some of these today. Of course, we have the hurricane approaching Florida. I don't remember, I don't know where this, a friend of mine found this and put it on his Facebook page. I thought it was pretty good. And we don't know what's going to, listen, we don't know what's going to happen with the storm, right? And everybody's out, oh, they're engineering, this is engineered weather. And because somebody on the Weather Channel said, well, this could sit, off the coast there and churn for 7 days. Oh, see, that proves they're planning to do this. Now, to me, look, I think people can mess around with a lot of things in our world that I don't know about with technology. But I don't know that having a hurricane, where hurricanes have happened historically time and time again, is like a big display. I mean, do a hurricane in Kansas, then I think you can really engineer the weather. That's just my view, okay? I don't think about things the way a lot of people think. Just ask my wife. But pray for the people down there, because this is, I heard it, I think it reached a category 5. We don't know if it's going to hit Florida. It's hitting the Bahamas either now or very shortly. It may go up the coast. It may cause a lot of flooding. It may go inland. These things sort of have a mind of their own. And a lot of times it's hard to know. It's like everybody left Florida and went up to Georgia. Now I guess they all got to go back to Florida, I guess, or maybe go to Tennessee or someplace. But who knows what's going to happen. So some of the cultural things that are going on is I don't know how else to say it other than it's crazy out there. So Thursday or Friday, I guess it was Thursday, the DOJ report, the Inspector General's report on James Comey came out. And believe me, in terms of having read a lot of these things, this savaged James Comey. And within 5 minutes of it coming out, I happened to be home that morning, watching the news, and when it was released, and immediately Comey was saying, I'm completely exonerated, I need an apology. And I'm like, on what planet do you think you're entitled to an apology? And Kimberly Strassel, she was on Dennis Prager Friday to be interviewed about this, and she's a very good thinker, and she said something about that what happened here, according to Comey, what happened was what really happened, the Inspector General's report was like me getting a speeding ticket on a way to warn the village that a fire is coming. That's Comey's view. Strassel said, and I don't know if it came from her or she saw someplace else, she said no. What happened was Comey set the village on fire and then spent 2 years telling the village that it was for its own good. And I think that's more accurate about what happened. Now, University of Michigan, we officially here in Columbus, Ohio, we don't really care for the University of Michigan unless you went to the University of Michigan. And if you look at this, why do you even care about the University of Michigan? Other than to keep your kids from going there, they now have this thing at the University of Michigan called Campus Climate Support. What it is you can be brought up on charges at the University of Michigan, and you're not even going to know why somebody made charges against you. So here's their campus climate concern. A campus climate concern can include actions that discriminate, stereotype, exclude, harass, or harm anyone in our community based on their identities, such as race, color, ethnicity, national origin, sex, gender identity or expression, sexual orientation, disability, age, or religion. Concerns may stem from fear, misunderstanding, hatred, or stereotypes. Behaviors may be intentional or unintentional. Now, look, if this is the attitude of the University of Michigan, they're not winning any national championship this year. Okay? Praise the Lord for that, right? And they talk about campus climate concerns may come in many forms. If you feel that you experienced harm and would like to discuss, please call, and there's the number. Campus climate concerns may involve conduct that does not violate any law or university policy. Some cases, however, do involve conduct that may violate federal, state, or local laws or University of Michigan policies. So you're may not even violate a policy and you can still be brought up. And if you don't go through the process, you can be expelled from the university. This is political correctness run amok. In Australia, a member of parliament, Sonia Hornery, went to Newcastle, celebrated diversity at the Newcastle Pride Group Page Festival. Unfortunately, members of a local church thought it appropriate to put out hate flyers targeting people attending the festival. They handed out tracts, heaven or hell, it's your decision, and this is automatically hate speech now. And at the end, look at what she says. I understand everyone has different beliefs, views, and ideas, but we also have the right to, we don't have the right to force these on other people. I will be following this matter up further with a number of authorities. I believe she's in the, I don't remember what she's in. This is something that somebody just gave me right as I was walking in. Planned Parenthood executive vice president has come out and she is now saying, teach your preschoolers their genitals don't determine their gender. And here's a Planned Parenthood video that they've put up about this particular situation. Now, I read somebody write about this the other day, and they said, you know, kids are, you let the kid express their opinion about what gender they are, and you take it like it's the gospel truth. And it's like, when did we start listening to our kids like this? Like that 16-year-old girl from Sweden who's running around the world lecturing everybody on climate change. She sailed on a boat from England to New York because it was, carbon neutral. Got the boat to New York, and they flew 6 people on a private jet across the Atlantic to pick up the boat and take it back to England. And it's hypocrisy of an epic scale. The attacks are coming in a lot of different ways. Here's an article in the Washington Post the other day, how white nationalists align themselves with the anti-abortion movement. And I think this is a perfect example of how the left has no concern for the truth. It's all about feeling. Because they say, well, they're pro-life and they want babies to born, but they hate immigrants, so they want to keep out the brown people. And the eugenics involved in the Planned Parenthood movement in its early days, Margaret Sanger and those people, were about as anti-minority as you could ever get because they wanted to remove the minority classes, the lower classes. And so now they turn it around. They try to turn it on to people who are against abortion and pro-life. And in there she goes, for reproductive rights supporters in the United States, it's long been easy to see the Republican Party hardline anti-abortion politics as a kind of grotesque hypocrisy. How can a political body that has lined itself against school lunches and 4 machine guns claim to support life? It's just insanity. But, usually when we want insanity to be judged, we go to a psychiatrist. So CNN had a psychiatrist on to talk about Donald Trump the other day. And this is I think he's the head of the psychiatric department at Duke University, supposedly a good institution with religious roots. And this is what he had to say.
Well, I think that medicalizing politics has 3 very dire consequences. The first is that it stigmatizes the mentally ill. I've known thousands of patients. Almost all of them have been well-behaved, well-mannered, good people. Trump is none of these. Lumping the mentally ill with Trump is a terrible insult to the mentally ill, and they have enough problems and stigma as it is. The second issue is that calling Trump crazy hides the fact that we're crazy for having elected him, and even crazier for allowing his crazy policies to persist. Trump is as destructive a person in this century as Hitler, Stalin, and Mao were in the last century. He may be responsible for many more million deaths than they were. He needs to be contained, but he needs to be contained by attacking his policies, not his person.
Now,
Brian
Stelter, the host, he got in a lot of trouble. It's like, why didn't you stop this nut? And I'm not sure crazy is a psychiatric diagnosis, but we'll leave that alone for the moment. And Brian Stelzer goes, well, I had somebody talking in my ear and I didn't really hear what he was saying or that type of thing, but you heard him when he first started talking. He goes, remember, he was paying attention. So it's a lot of this is insanity. Thomas More Law Center, this is again up in Michigan, uncovered taxpayer-funded Islamic propaganda forced on teachers in the Novi School District. They got a copy of the seminar put on by a Muslim activist, believe she's associated with CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations, and it completely whitewashed the history of Islam, and it denigrated Christians and Jews. And they paid for a 2-day seminar, and she's done this for many, many school districts. She got paid $5,000 for a 2-day seminar. I'll go up there for half that for a day and go get David Wood down in, he's down around Dearborn. Go get him and take care of this. Look, this is what's happening this is a great article in from the Wall Street Journal, The Weaponization of History. The 1619 Project. I talked a little bit about this on an interview I did on Minute to Midnight this week. It's up on YouTube. The New York Times a couple weeks ago came out with in their New York Times Sunday magazine, the 1619 Project. And essentially it says everything that's good in America came from slavery because we had slavery and oppressed people. Now listen, slavery was horrible, it was wrong, it was evil, it was particularly evil the way it was instituted in America. But we did get rid of it, it took a long time, still working through some of those issues. But what they're doing is they're going back and they're rewriting history to make everybody a racist that they don't agree with. You need to understand this. This is the Outlook section of this morning's Washington Post. The reasonable rebels. Lady says, look, I hear the conservatives say, well, we're reasonable people. We're not like the white nationalists. And so what did she say? That's exactly what I heard people say about the Confederacy. I heard people in the Confederacy that had slaves and plantations, and they said the exact same words. So since you're using the same words that they use, you're a racist. And history, as we sit here right now, history is being rewritten. This is a methodology of totalitarian governments. The trajectory of this is going to be ultimately rise to what I believe the level of the son of perdition that we talked about earlier. It's also what they used to do in the old Soviet Union, where the common phrase was, the future is known, it's the past that keeps changing. Because they would go back and they would rewrite history. That's why Stalin and some other people disappeared essentially from history books, what had actually happened. The past was always changing in the Soviet Union. Pretty much knew it was going to happen in the future, but you didn't know you could never be sure about the past, even though it was history. This is a doctor, this is an article from about 6 weeks ago, Dr. Alan Josephson, I can't remember the university he's associated with. He came out, he was at a Heritage Foundation forum, and he said, I'm concerned about where this gender identity, gender dysphoria thing is going. We're forcing these drugs on kids that haven't reached puberty yet. Because we're just sort of taking the kids at their words. In it, he says, I saw parents and children being hurt by this. These kids are, for the most part, very vulnerable people. You can see that when they spend time with them, certainly the teenagers have multiple problems. Most of the time, 60 or 70% of the time, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, they're hurting people. And parents are confused because they're basically getting one message from the medical and mental health profession, and that is affirm people. And so I have encouraged people to explore before prescribing treatment, specifically to consider other developmental factors, family factors that have gone into the insecurities that are associated with this. And he said, listen, the reason I spoke up, and I think he's lost his job. His contract was not renewed at the university that he was at because he did this. He got attacked by the leftist pro-LGBTQ gender identity mob, and he's out of a job. he said, look, I spoke up. I'm at the end of my career, and there's no reason for me not to speak out and tell the truth. If I get fired, so be it. Now listen, Christians have to go through this thought process too. At some point, you got to stand up and say, enough is enough. And then if you disagree, he's the bully, but he gets fired and shoved out of a job because he stands up against this, I think, just nonsense. Here's another one that's kind of an interesting thing. A landmark study released this week. Now, The Economist talked about this study, and it says a scientific study has established that there's no gay gene. Now, The Economist is not a Christian, right-wing, conservative publication. And they said, didn't establish that there's a gay gene. Now, the LGBTQ Nation, and even the Wall Street Journal said, genetics tied to same-sex behavior, and the LGBTQ Nation website says, new landmark study finds that genetics influences sexual orientation. So here's a study that comes out, and it reaches conclusions. You can look it up and read it. And nobody agrees with what it really says, because everybody is, at least some of these are basing this on a political agenda, not necessarily what the facts are. We've really reached a point where this is going to continue on and on and on, I think, until the Lord returns. Here's a survey. Old and young diverge on values. This is kind of an interesting thing. This was published in the Wall Street Journal on Monday, and it is a Wall Street Journal News telephone poll conducted August 10th to 14th. So here, look at this. Patriotism, whether you think that's an important value. Generation Z, millennials, ages 18 to 38, a little bit above 40%. Generation X, ages 39 to 54, about 65%. Boomers and silent majority ages 55 to 91, about 80% thought the patriotism was important. Look at the numbers when you go to religion, belief in God. Millennials, Generation Z, 30%. 52% in Generation X, and about 68% in the boomers. Having children, just a little over 30% among millennials. Here's the other thing that's the childbearing age right now, okay? Boomers, silent ages, 55 to 91, they're not having kids at that age for the most part. Now, I talked a little bit, and part of this is going to lead to a population collapse. We see it happening already, and people are talking about it. Now, Elon Musk from Tesla has come out. He's pushing this kind of concept called the Neuralink, which is sort of like a chip connecting the brain and helping you with speech and that type of thing. And he has big plans for this. So he was with Jack Ma, who's the CEO of the Chinese company Alibaba, at an artificial intelligence conference in, I believe, Shanghai recently. And they were talking about some of the big issues about artificial intelligence and that type of thing. And here's just a short clip from what they had to say, particularly about population collapse.
I'm worried about the birth rate, which you alluded to earlier. Contrary to, most people think we have too many people on the planet, but actually this is an outdated view. This is assuming that AI is fine, assuming that there's a benevolent future with AI. I think that the biggest problem the world will face in 20 years is population collapse.
I agree.
I want to emphasize this. The biggest issue in 20 years will be population collapse. Not explosion, collapse. It's very easy to see what the world will look like in 20 years because humans have a 20-year boot sequence. So you say, okay, well, who was born last year? Okay, now you know what the world look like in 20 years. It's that easy.
I absolutely agree with that. The population problem is going to be facing huge challenge. 1.4 billion people in China sounds a lot, but I think next 20 years we'll see this thing will bring big trouble to China, and the population decreasing of the speed of population decreasing is going to speed up. And you call it collapse. I agree with
accelerating
that.
collapse.
Accelerating collapse.
And then the common.
Watching my updates, you wonder? This is true. This is one of these convergence issues that I think is really important as to why what's going on now is it's another reason why I think it's a big deal. Because a lot of these countries facing collapse are players in end-time Bible prophecy, and they're not going to sit by and wait because they can't wait 20 years because they may not be around in 20 years. So here are two of the wealthiest men in the world talking about one of the major problems that they see in the world is population collapse and demographics. And I think Elon Musk had a good statement when he said, if you want to know what the world looks like in 20 years, the question is pretty simple. Who was born last year? And then you can figure out what the world's going to look like in 20 years. We're not making new people other than the ones that were born last year. Pretty good. At another point in the comments of the discussion, Jack Moss says, well, 99% of predictions about the future are wrong. To which Elon Musk said, including that one? Think about it. Think about it. If you laugh out loud on the way home, that's good. That means you got it. Okay? So a lot of information. You don't have to get it right away. That's okay. This is something that I saw at Fast Company. Goodness. Social credit, Silicon Valley is building it. They now have a way that if you're not such a good customer on Uber, you ring for an Uber car, it won't come because you've been rated down. This social credit system has gone into, we know in China, it's been used quite a bit. China's prisons are swelling after deluge of arrest engulfs Muslims. This is in this morning's New York Times with graphics. Look at in the Muslim region of Western China, the Uyghur region. I can't remember the name of the province, but look at the imprisonment rates, how they've changed over time. The red line being Xinjiang province, where the Uyghurs live. Look at that. The percentage of them, people sentenced to prison terms of 5 years or longer in 2017 compared to those in other areas of China, 87% in the Xinjiang province. All other provinces were 14%. Now, it's interesting that the Muslim countries are sort of giving China a pass on this. Why? Because China has worked itself economically into them, one belt, one road, all of these things. The Pope this week put up a committee. You might remember this agreement that he signed with this Islamic imam back in Abu Dhabi in February, March, sometime around there, about, the religions of the world need to unite. Now he's appointed another committee to put that into place. Now, let's go to Middle East. Goodness, I have. Early in the week, Israel struck Iranian targets in Syria. There were also some drones that were shot down in Beirut. Now, there's a lot of question about where the drones came from that were shot down in Beirut. I showed you last week, they couldn't have flown. That's probably not accurate. I said they couldn't have flown from, say, the Golan Heights to Beirut, a distance of about 40 miles or so, maybe 50 miles, because the drones just don't go that long. Now, some people have said, well, they had extender packages on it. Other people said they were launched from boats in the Mediterranean. And still others have said, well, those look like Iranian drones. And the suggestion in that case is what Israel did was they took control of the Iranian drones and flew them into a couple buildings in Beirut where they think they were manufacturing things. So there's been a lot of back and forth this week. The IDF has been on high alert. Nasrallah, he gave a speech in Lebanon where he talked about, we're going to respond to this. We won't let this stand. We're coming after you. Netanyahu came back with a response. Listen, we don't need your. For some reason now my videos are stopping to work. Well, anyway. And Netanyahu came out with another speech and said, listen, Nasrallah, you need to calm down. Arabic language newspapers in Lebanon came out with headlines. This is Al-Akbar from Beirut, Lebanon, Arabic, and this is the headline here essentially says, retribution is inevitable, and that's a Hezbollah soldier, militia member standing overlooking Israel. Soleimani came out and he said, what we're seeing here are the last tries of the Zionist regime. He gave a speech and he said, the Zionist regime has become much weaker than in the past, and these attacks, I feel the instability of the Zionist regime. Rouhani, even he gave a speech, said there'd be no change in Iran-U.S. relations, but he also said this, that they must recognize, speaking of the U.S., they must recognize our revolution, our regime, and the rights of our people, and they must reject their mistakes. With regard to the relations between Iran and America, unless America gives up the sanctions and rejects the erroneous path it has chosen, we will see no positive change. If you lift all the sanctions and bow down before the Iranian people, the circumstances will be different. So that's how they sort of responded. Netanyahu, again, he came out with a speech and he essentially said, listen, Nasrallah, relax, chill, man. I suggest you calm down. You can find that on YouTube. I don't want to take the time to play the whole thing. I'm trying to remember what else is going on here. ISIS is rekindling itself in the Middle East. I'm going to have a little interview with Brian Schrager in a few minutes, and we'll let him talk a little bit about that. So here's just, here's a summary from I-24 News. I'm going to turn the sound off on that. Essentially, Nasrallah came out a couple days later and said, hey, we're coming after you. We're going to retaliate. We're going to do 24 hours, 72 hours. We're going to do something. It's been longer than that now. It was very interesting to watch the progression. Once they came out, Hezbollah responded. The IDF came out with publications and videos. One of these was they produced the command chain of who was planning the drone attack on Israel from Iraq. That's why they bombed things. They then released another video where they went even further, talking about where Hezbollah is, that they're doing precision-guided missiles. This is what they were doing in the building in Beirut that was attacked. It goes through and identifies the people who are heading up the Al-Quds brigades, or the Al-Quds force commanders who are heading up and instructing Hezbollah and giving commands to Hezbollah, and on the precision-guided missile project. And then they came out with another video yet again that what Israel had done. They had exposed this. So Israel's been doing a very detailed progression on how they're going to respond to this. Nasrallah gave a speech yesterday and from a super secret bunker hidden away deep inside the belly of the bedrock around Beirut or someplace. He never comes out in the open, very, very rarely, because it would cost him. Probably, people are looking for him. And he said, look, Israel has to pay a price. We're coming after you. Now, there were some suggestions that in northern Israel there might be an attack coming. This has all happened within the last 24 hours. If you've been to northern Israel, there's a place called Sheba Farms. And this is up here. You see the little Sheba Farms right here, north of Tel Dan and up near Gajar. So if you've been to Israel, you've been to some of these archaeological sites. Banyas is where Caesarea Philippi was, where Jesus, had that discussion with his disciples, who do you say that I am? About 2.5 miles away is Tel Dan. That's where Jeroboam erected a golden calf. And you can go, you can see the actual, in my teachings on Ezekiel chapter 23, particularly, I talk about that quite a bit. You can actually see the foundations. And the line, the Syrian border in 1967 ran right along the north side of the Tel there. The Sheba Farms area was part of Syria at the time, even though Lebanon claimed it. So Syria and Lebanon don't even agree on this. And the village of Gajar, here to the left, from Tel Dan up to Gajar is about 2 miles. From Caesarea Philippi to Tel Dan is about 2.5 miles. So Sheba Farms is not that big. So there's been a lot of troop movement and what other military equipment movement in that area. So some people think there's an attack coming on a military installation, not a civilian installation, in that area. Interesting story about Gajar in the 67 war. Israel took over all this land. But they didn't worry about Gajar because nobody was attacking them from Gajar. It's an Alawite village. And a few weeks went by after the 67 war was over, and the elders of Gajar came walking down the hill towards Tel Dan, waving white flags, saying, hey, we're starving up here. Everybody forgot about us. We'd like to be part of Israel. So they did make it part of Israel for a while. Then the UN and its infinite wisdom came through and divided the city between Lebanon and Israel about 8 or 9 years ago, 2010. So that's sort of a little bit of the geographics of that area. There's a little bit closer picture. So there's some thinking that this is going to be, the IDF has been put on high alert. This morning, I have some tweets. There were, this is some video and a picture of some of the artillery was shot from Lebanon into northern Israel, and Israel has responded. You can sort of see they're trying to put out the fire, and later in that video, you can find it at Aurora Intel on Twitter, one of the intelligence sites that open intelligence source people that I follow, because they seem to be able to get information quickly. They have several people working. So right now, as we speak, there's stuff going on in the northern part of Israel. I don't know if it's calmed down for the evening since it's getting close to dark over there. But all of this is happening. Jonathan Spire, who I hope to interview in a few weeks or soon, has a phenomenal article in the Wall Street Journal the other day on Wednesday. The Iran-Israel war is here. And he says, listen, let me just summarize it. You should look it up and read it. I might be behind a paywall. But I think I saw it posted the text posted in some Facebook groups. But he said, listen, we are at war with Iran right now. It's, in fact, let me just pull up. I want to read a couple quotes out of this. Oops. Why did they design the iPad so whichever way you turn it, you think you have it right side up? But then the button you need is never where you want it. So, Spire. Israel and Iran are at war. Israel strikes this week in southern Syria, western Iraq, and eastern Lebanon, and possibly even Beirut confirm it. War is a very 21st century affair. For now, it involves only small circles among the Israeli and Iranian populations. Parts of the Air Force, intelligence services, and probably special forces are active on the Israeli side. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, its Expeditionary Quds Force, and proxy politico-military organizations in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon are engaged on behalf of Iran. The war marks a hinge point. Listen, Jonathan Spire is originally from England. He's one of the most, I think, well-thought, well-reasoned, good writers on what's going on in the Middle East. I try to follow he has a blog. and the name of it escapes me at the moment. But listen to what he says. The war, and then, filter this through the Bible prophecy filter that we look at these things through. The war marks a hinge point in Middle Eastern geopolitics. For the past decade and a half, the region has been engaged mainly with internal strife, civil wars, insurgencies, and mass protests. These are now largely spent, leaving a broken landscape along the northern route from Iran to Israel. The three states in between, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, are fragmented, partly collapsed, and thoroughly penetrated by neighboring powers. Their official state structures have lost the attribute that alone, according to German sociologist Max Weber, guarantees sovereignty. Monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force. These nations' territory has become the theater of the Iran-Israel war. The regime in Tehran favors the destruction of the Jewish state, but this is a long-standing aim dating back to the 1979 Islamic Revolution and before it in the minds of the revolutionaries. What's brought it to the fore is that Iran has emerged in the past half-decade as the primary beneficiary of the collapse of the Iraqi, Syrian, and Lebanese states. This has substantially increased its capacity to menace Israel, which has noticed and responded. Iran's Revolutionary Guard has no peer in the Middle East and perhaps beyond in the practice of irregular warfare. Very important article. Iran treats this entire area as a single operational space, moving its assets around at will without excessive concern for the notional sovereignty of the governments of Baghdad, Beirut, and Damascus. Lebanese Hezbollah unit trains PMU militia fighters in Iraq. Iraqi Shiite militias are deployed at crucial and sensitive points on the Iraqi-Syrian border, such as Al-Qaim and Mayadeen. Revolutionary Guard and Hezbollah personnel operate in southwest Syria, close to the Golan Heights. Israeli attacks in recent days suggest that Israel, too, has begun to act according to these definitions and in response to them. If Iran will not restrict its actions to Syria, neither will Israel. And he makes a good point. Israel has no interest in the internal political arrangements of Lebanon, Syria, or Iraq, except insofar as these constitute a danger to Israel itself. And he concludes with this paragraph. So it is war between Israel and Iran, prosecuted over the ruins of Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria. But it won't necessarily stay that way. A single kinetic and successful Iranian response to Israel's airstrikes could rapidly precipitate an escalation to a much broader contest. State-to-state conflict has returned to the Middle East. It's a phenomenal article that I think you should find. There was also an Iranian missile test. This is the launch pad. The president tweeted out a picture of the launch pad after the tests failed, and it blew up. And you can see the damage there. And immediately, of course, everybody's on Twitter, oh, the president is revealing classified things. Like, this has never happened before. Like, Ronald Reagan didn't have pictures that he used, that George Bush didn't use things about Iraq, that John F. Kennedy didn't have pictures of the Bay of Pigs and the Russian missiles in Cuba. The president really has sort of the authority to say, hey, this shouldn't be classified, if this is in fact classified. And so then the response from the Iranians this morning was, hey, we still have our satellite. Well, we don't know if that's the same one that was on the rocket that they were going to launch or not. Certainly, if they had the satellite, it needs a rocket to get into orbit anyway. So I'm not sure that this is the Iranian people are acting like this is a great victory. Okay, great, you got a satellite. Doesn't work on the ground very well. Unless you want to take some really high definition selfies of yourself, I guess, in the lab. But this is interesting too, this Iranian tanker. It was named the Grace, now it's been renamed. It's been cruising around the Mediterranean. This thing left Iran back in April, and so for now, 4 months, going on 5 months, this thing's been cruising around the Horn of Africa. It was stuck in Gibraltar for a while. Now it's been released, and now it looks like it's going to Syria, which everybody said they can't go to Syria, and they're doing it anyway. You sort of get the impression that the Iranians don't play by the rules, I guess is the best way to say. Another thing that's interesting that's going on all the time with this, a lot of trouble in northern Syria around Idlib. The Syrian government took over a Turkish observation post around Idlib. They've been bombing 500,000 people. How many of you have heard this? Over 500,000 people in the last month have been displaced. It means they've moved in a relatively rural area to the desert. I mean, this is a humanitarian crisis. 500,000 people, that's like a lot of people. And they've been displaced by this. And so in Russia this week, Erdogan from Turkey showed up to meet with Vladimir Putin because he's trying to get things. They actually engaged, they had ice cream cones, and Putin was the ultimate host. He showed them the stealth fighter, the Su-57 fifth generation fighter that they have. And they had talks, they had a news conference, they sat down and Erdogan says, "Is that what we're going to buy?" And Putin says, you can buy it. Then they had a news conference, and then they had a little sit down to discuss these things. So this is, as I sort of watch these world leaders running around, they're always, everywhere you go, they're meeting. Their frequent flyer miles must be off the charts if they're flying commercial. And they're always just sort of standing around, shaking hands, posing for pictures. But one of the significant things you need to know, this is from understandingwar.org, the Institute for the Study of War, has pretty good analysis of the brown areas are places where Russia has military cooperation agreements, and other places where they're working on building bases and that sort of thing. So you can see, in fact, some of the players that we talk about in Ezekiel 38, Sudan and Libya, Russia is bringing them into their orbit, which seems to be kind of an interesting development. Well, I won't spend too much time on this. The UN actually, though, came out. This is kind of a weird world we live in. A UN committee expressed rare criticism on Palestinian hate speech and incitement. And what they looked about, they said there's hate speech in certain media outlets, especially those controlled by Hamas, social media, public official statements, and school curricula and textbooks. And weren't we talking about that over the last 2 or 3 weeks? About how these textbooks in the Palestinian areas have all this hate speech in them. And the UN has actually come out and said, hey, you need to stop using this stuff. In the Jerusalem Port this week, the cover is a book by Seth Frantzman that was just released called After ISIS. I haven't written a review of it. I've read part of it. Seth gave me a pre-publication copy. And I would say, as I read through what was happening in these ISIS areas, it was like the worst horror story of a twisted mind that you could imagine. And then I realized Seth Frantzman is a tremendous journalist who's really concerned about presenting facts. And he's presenting facts of something that's actually happening in our world and what's happening in the ISIS areas. So they have a big launch party coming up in about 10 days for that on September 11th. There's an excellent article in the Jerusalem Post, Jerusalem Report, by Yossi Melman talking about the 7 fronts that Israel faces. And here's a little graphic of the 7 fronts: Iranian in the Red Sea, ISIS in Sinai, Hamas controlled by Iran in the Gaza Strip, Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria. You have, of course, the Palestinian organizations in the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, and then also Iran controlling militias in Iraq. It's a very volatile situation. So I'm going to truncate this a little bit. I will be done in about 6 or 7 minutes, but let me just say this. In 722 BC, this is a picture, a drawing that somebody did of the fall of Samaria. Samaria was the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. The Assyrians came and attacked Samaria. You can read about that and some other things on the Taylor Prism. I've actually saw this with my own eyes. It's much bigger there on the screen than it actually is in person. But it's a story of Sennacherib and what he did when he attacked and laid siege to the cities of the northern kingdom of Israel, and then went over to Jerusalem. And we know what happened at Jerusalem under the king Hezekiah. 185,000 Syrians were slain by the angel of the Lord in one night. And that's not mentioned, by the way, by Sennacherib. It was sort of like, I laid siege, I took over all these cities, I got tribute from Hezekiah, and I came home. It's sort of fake news. I guess it's the whole thing is based on a little bit fake news. Also at the British Museum are these reliefs from Assyria. This is Sennacherib. These are called the Lachish panels. When in 701, he was going into the southern kingdom of Judah. Whereas the northern kingdom has fallen now 20 years before. And he laid siege to the second most important city, Lachish, actually built a siege ramp. You can go to Lachish today and you can see the remnants of the city sat very high on a hill. And like the Romans did at Masada, they built a siege ramp to go up and eventually take the city. And here's a picture of some of the people of Judah being taken. This has been a big, but it has manifestations today. I'm going to play a short part of an interview I did late yesterday afternoon with Brian Schrager from the Jerusalem Journal.net and the Haim Report. Brian was recently in Erbil in the Kurdish area of Iraq. This is ancient Syria. Erbil is, 20, 30 miles maybe from Mosul. He couldn't go to Mosul because that's where ISIS had some of its most horrific things. But as you see in this one report, the Christian population in recent time has gone from, and some of these Christian communities in Mosul and these areas of Iraq and Syria, these have been around for 1,700 years. Some trace their roots back to the Apostle Mark. You can go and you can see the tomb of Nahum there. So Brian was given an opportunity. He has an article that he just wrote that was in the Jerusalem Post on Friday about his trip to London with a group of cancer patients, young children between the ages of like 6 and 25, 100 and some went to London. And he was actually able to go see some of those reliefs at the British Museum about Assyria. But he had just gotten back from Assyria, Iraq, the Kurdish area. Here's just a short part of the interview. I'll try to edit the whole thing and put it up. So here's Brian Schrager from Jerusalem Journal. I'm here with Brian Schrager, and Brian is the editor, publisher of the Jerusalem Journal.net website and also the Haim Report, CHAIM. And Brian had an opportunity recently to go to the Kurdish area of Iraq. There's an article in the either just released or soon to be released Jerusalem Report that's published by Jerusalem Post newspaper, that an article that he is doing. So Brian, excuse me. So Brian, welcome to our little interview today.
Thanks, Don.
Good to talk to you again. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that you did, or the opportunity that you have, and the opportunity that I think from talking to you that you have coming up pretty soon to go back to what we would call Kurdistan. And let's just tell us what happened a couple months ago and what you plan on doing.
Well, the first thing, and Kurdistan, a bit serendipitous. I was at an Independence Day picnic, Israel Independence Day picnic, in April with my friends Seth Franzman and Jonathan Spire. And Jonathan said, "Oh, I'm going to Erbil for a month." And I said, "Oh, really?" I said, maybe I should join you. He said, sure, come on over. And so actually that I did. I ended up going. I thought I was only going to be there for 2 weeks, and I ended up being there 4 weeks. I flew from Amman into Erbil. Erbil is a city of over 1 million people. It's a very interesting place. It's an interesting mixture of third world and first world. You have some very, very nice establishments, like hotels and restaurants, and then you've got some very third world kind of streets and conditions. They're all kind of mixed together. It's a city that's trying to come into the modern age, but isn't there yet.
And I just so the people that are listening understand, this Kurdish area of Iraq, in some respects, it's part of Iraq, but it's independently governed, I believe. Is that correct?
It is. It's technically part of Iraq, the nation, but it functions as its own country. It's a de facto country of its own. So anybody, at least from the U.S. and perhaps other countries in the West, can fly into Erbil and get their passport stamped with a 30-day visa that says Erbil, and then I think it's in Arabic, it says Kurdistan. However, with that visa in your passport, you cannot go into Iraq proper. There is considerable animosity between Iraq proper and Iraqi Kurdistan, because in 2017 there was a referendum in Iraqi Kurdistan and they voted for it to be independent, right? And that angered Baghdad, and a lot of their funding was cut off. And so now there's animosity between the two places. But Erbil is the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan. It has its parliament there. It has ministry buildings there. And it's very much its own government. Yes, and they've been that way for a long, long time, so that there actually are some interesting similarities between the Kurds and the Jews. The Kurds being a people without a land or country of their own for a couple thousand years, much like the Jews. And also, they have been subject to persecution throughout that time. Yeah, when you're in Erbil, you know you're in oil country because the smell of gas is pervasive. It's a bit oppressive, especially when I was there in June, July, because the daily temperature was about 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and the humidity was low, but with that much heat and often not much wind, all of those gas fumes were being inhaled throughout the day.
Well, let me truncate this just in the interest of time. I'll put the whole interview, an edited version of the interview up. But I want to say that Brian's been given an opportunity to maybe go back in October. If somebody listening to this on YouTube or whatever would like to donate, you can go to jerusalemjournal.net/donate. Costs for a trip like that are rather expensive. You have to hire a car, people that will sort of keep you from driving into areas where you shouldn't drive. Brian's been given an opportunity to hook up with the Kurdish Christian community. There's some large churches there. Really can't share information about that. They're very sensitive to having any identifying information about them because Kurdish area is largely Muslim. There used to be, for thousands of years, from the Syrian captivity in 722 BC, there were Jews, a pretty thriving community of Jews. I think in the early 1900s, when they did a demographic study of Iraq, the Jews up in that area were that was the biggest population, the group that had the largest population. Now there's zero. ISIS drove the Christians out of Mosul. You saw the statistics from that one article. Used to be 15,000, now there are 40 estimated. And so I asked, so you'll see when you listen to it. So, Brian needs, it's probably about $10,000 it's going to cost to do this trip. He's not making any money off of this, trust me. So if you'd like to contribute, do that if the Lord leads on that. But certainly what he needs is prayer. As you'll see in the interview, this is if you go to the British Museum and you look at these panels of what Sennacherib did, what the Assyrians did, there's huge rooms of these at the British Museum. It's unbelievable. They brought these back in the mid-1800s when they did archaeology of these sites. If you want to know how cruel, remember how Jonah didn't really want to go to Nineveh? There was a reason. The Assyrians were pretty bad people. The only people in modern times that sort of approach them or equal them is ISIS. And ISIS is reconstituting itself. And this is a problem. And I did ask him a very interesting question. So I said, look, the Christians are being persecuted, not so much by Muslims, but by the Iranian agents that have kind of infiltrated into that Kurdish area. And there's a lot of Iranian expats there. They've fled Iraq, Christians, or fled Iran because they're persecuted in Iran. And now they've come to Erbil. But what are their options now? Look at the map. Let's see, we're in Erbil. We go to the west, that's Mosul. That's ISIS country. We go to western Syria, eastern Syria. That's in a revolution, and that's ISIS country. We go south towards Baghdad. That's Iraqi, Shia, Iranian-funded groups, militias. We go north, we're into Turkey or Iran. And I asked him, I said, and it was a very interesting response, I didn't prompt him on this. You remember when I started this talk today, I talked about Matthew chapter 24? And Jesus says, when you see these things, flee to the mountains. So I asked Brian, I said, what are their options, our Christian brothers and sisters? And he said the only option they have now is to flee to the mountains. And he talks, you'll see in the interview when I get it up, I'll try to have it up in a couple, 3 days. It's a very good picture for how the church maybe should respond to the persecution that's coming. They live in an area of hyperinflation, they're persecuted, can't trust people, but Brian says they get by and they go to church and they do Christian things, even in the face of all that persecution. It's kind of humbling to listen to him describe that. So pray for Brian. This is the gods, and the Ishtar was like the patron goddess of that area. And these gods, the physical gods that the Assyrians have, were really, I think, sort of a physical representation of the demonic forces that are still at work in that area. It's some of the stuff that goes on there is just unbelievable. You've read the stories about ISIS. There's spiritual warfare going on there, and I think Brian feels it, so he can always use prayer cover for that. And I think we can all use more and more prayer cover for each other for that. So I'll put that up. But look, God has us in his hand. And I think we should just pray that whatever happens, that God use us for his glory. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for your word, and I just pray, Lord, that it will be the prayer of our hearts that whatever happens, whatever comes our way, that in our lives, that you will give us opportunities to share the gospel, to disciple others, and to act as people of God should act, and that you would use all of that to your glory. In Jesus' name, amen.